In this episode of Biographers in Conversation, Professor Stephen Campbell, a distinguished scholar of Renaissance art, chats with me about his choices while researching and crafting Leonardo da Vinci, An Untraceable Life. Few historical figures have captivated the imagination of scholars and the public as much as Leonardo da Vinci, the quintessential Renaissance polymath. Leonardo's name evokes images of masterful paintings, groundbreaking scientific sketches, and enigmatic notebooks filled with ideas. Yet despite the wealth of material he left behind, Leonardo remains in many ways an enigma. An artist and thinker whose life, motivations, and inner world resist simple interpretation. In Leonardo da Vinci, An Untraceable Life, Stephen Campbell offers a fresh perspective on this elusive genius, challenging traditional narratives and inviting readers to reconsider the very nature of historical biography. Rather than just celebrating Leonardo's legendary Renaissance man image, Stephen explores the blank spaces and puzzles that other biographies often gloss over. While many authors have written about Leonardo, Stephen Campbell invites us to pause and ask, what do we really know about Leonardo the person? It turns out that despite Leonardo's fame and the thousands of pages of notes and drawings he left behind, large parts of his life remain mysterious. For long stretches of time, the historical record about him is silent, gaps that have been often filled with speculation. In An Untraceable Life, Stephen argues that Leonardo's existence defies the linear and cohesive storytelling often imposed upon historical figures. Instead of focusing solely on the masterpieces such as The Last Supper and Mona Lisa, Stephen explores the gaps, uncertainties, and contradictions in Leonardo's life. During our conversation today, we'll explore why Leonardo remains such an elusive subject and how Stephen tackled the challenge of writing about a genius who sometimes seems to slip through the cracks of history. We'll chat about the myths that continue to shape our understanding of Leonardo and why, despite centuries of scholarship, he remains as untraceable as ever. Stephen, welcome to Biographers in Conversation.
Thank you, Gabriella. Delighted to be here.
Each of us has our own way of imagining Leonardo da Vinci. Please tell us about him.
Okay, so I think two things that are important to understand, and there's so much I could say in answer to that question. And most of the people listening to this broadcast will know something about, for instance, Leonardo's exceptional gifts as an artist. He regrounds painting in the study of light and of optics, we might say scientific interests like anatomy, the motions of air and water, that kind of thing. We could describe him as something like the culmination of a scientific tendency in early Renaissance art, which has a lot to do with the relationship that artists are exploring between painting and mathematics. And when you've understood how to draw according to mathematical principles, you can do all kinds of things. You can design machines, you can design buildings, etc. So he was special and distinct. I think he knew he was special and distinct. He was recognized as special and distinct. And I think he works hard in his work to show you that he's extraordinary. He's performing as extraordinary all the time. He's working so hard at this that many of his commissions are never finished, if they're ever even begun. We don't even know, for instance, if the Mona Lisa is finished. He has it with him for the last 15 years of his life, and he's constantly tweaking and retweaking it and trying a different glaze, a different film of modeling on the face and the hands, that kind of thing. I could go on, and I could just say that in terms of biographical facts, he's well documented for an artist of his time period. But that doesn't in itself mean that we know very much about Leonardo. It's especially the case for the first 40 years of his life. We have a record of his illegitimate birth in 1452. 20 years later, we have to wait 20 years before we know anything else about him. He appears in the membership roll of the Painters' Confraternity, the Company of St. Luke in Florence. So that's really it for his teenage years, for his childhood. And then the next thing we can learn, 4 years later, he's among a group of young men arrested and charged for having criminal sexual relations with a 17-year-old male apprentice. So he's charged with sodomy. And the charges are dismissed. They're thrown out a few days later. But that early document, in terms of just like biography, modern biographies of Leonardo, that's become the keystone of biographical writing on Leonardo, especially since Freud, at least the paintings and the writings being taken as encrypted symptoms of his sexual pathology. But being arrested for sodomy was nothing special in 15th century Florence. I mean, I think 3 to 4 out of 5 men under 30 were accused. It was a way of bringing down people, of making trouble for people. It also had something to do with the nature of male culture, the culture of young men in Florence at the time. But I should stop myself here. Yeah, there's many more things you want to ask, I think.
Thank you. That was wonderful what you said. What inspired you to write Leonardo da Vinci, and what silences and gaps in the study of his life were you hoping to fill?
I suppose I'd have to say I was trying to expose the silences and the gaps instead of pretending that they weren't there. Biographers have a tendency to fill them in. So I saw myself in a way as like somebody conserving an old painting where you have to take off all the overpaint, where a painting was damaged and it gets filled in. So I was just removing all that because I think those gaps and silences are historically very instructive. Why we have some kind of information about an individual from the past and not other kinds of information that, we're used to leaving, in our everyday phone messages, emails, etc. We're just documented in different ways today than people were 500 years ago.
It's interesting thinking about how biographers will research lives in the future, in the age of digital communication.
Exactly.
The title, An Untraceable Life, is intriguing. What do you mean by calling Leonardo's life untraceable? And how does that concept shape the way you narrate his story?
Yeah, there was a lot of back and forth about the title for this book. I suppose I that was the one I agreed to, because ultimately I talk about in the book that I really reject the possibility of a cradle-to-grave life story, for a pre-modern. Pre-modern, I mean anything before the 1700s to me is pre-modern. So I organized my narrative, if you could describe my book as a narrative at all, around paintings, around drawings, and around passages in Leonardo's writings. And I use those to illustrate what is it like to be in the life world of Leonardo, right? But it's not, I just think there are so many gaps, as I alluded to earlier, that we can't just line up the facts and events of his life. There are many social relationships. We don't know much about intimate relationships, for instance, in the records of Leonardo's life. So those episodes I concentrate on, whether they are pictorial, graphic, or written, I tend to see them, I suppose, as performances rather than disclosures, rather than materials as if Leonardo was writing an autobiography. It would never have occurred to Leonardo or any artist of his time to write what we would recognize as an autobiography. Now, we do have life writing by one or two artists in the generation before Leonardo, like the great goldsmith Lorenzo Ghiberti. But those lives are really a list of achievements, like we find in classical, ancient Roman, lives of famous Greek and Roman artists. They're records of achievements, where they are and what they're acclaimed for. There's not very much in there about the personal, the intimate, the everyday, right? If at all. They're exemplary. They are like my record of how I fulfilled the idea of a great artist.
Well, that leads into my next question, which is that you did originally plan to title the book Leonardo the Anti-Biography. Please tell us about your reason for this title and why in the published edition you changed it.
I thought it was kind of snappy. I liked the idea of the anti-biography. It was suggested to me that it was a bit negative, that it might alienate readers who are interested in biography, or interested in Leonardo's biography. Anti is just a bit too aggressive. Untraceable, less so. Untraceable just sounds more mysterious or something. And I do hope that my book is of interest to people listening to your broadcasts on biography, because I think it really is stimulated by an interest in life writing, and it's a key focus of the book. I suppose the original title, Anti-Biography, was because I found that Leonardo biographies recycle and repeat an image of Leonardo that's, apart from being stale, it's deeply misleading, and it's just banal, I suppose I would say. It's a formula.
Who is your intended audience? Is it a scholarly audience or the general reader?
I think I was trying to go for everything. I was thinking of my students, first of all, because I've been teaching Leonardo in the classroom, along with many other Renaissance artists and topics, for a good 30 years now, since my first job, really. And you can guarantee students will sign up for a course about Leonardo. And there's just a definite shortage of texts I could place in their hands. They would be, very good, solid scholarship. But in terms of something like overall, how we think about Leonardo's life, there's not so much. There's a very good biography by Charles Nicholl called Leonardo, the Flight of the Mind, but that tends to fill in the gaps a bit as well. There's an excellent study of Leonardo and science, how Leonardo's painting relates to science by Francesca Fiorani called The Shadow Drawing. But I wrote something I think that students would enjoy. And some of them have. They read the book and they come to my office to talk about it, with a list of questions, which is, I was really chuffed when that happens. And I was also thinking of colleagues who are interested in art or they're interested in the Renaissance. They're not specialists. And they will come across the latest Leonardo 9-day wonder, the latest sensational Leonardo discovery in the news. And they'll come and they ask me about it. And I was just saying, I get a bit tired. I don't know. I don't get tired. I love talking about Leonardo. But I sort of wanted to give them something to read, to arm them with some kind of critical edge when they're confronting these news stories, right? And at the end of the day, I thought, what kind of book do I like to read? And so I was, writing for myself. I tend to like books that are a little bit polemical, that take on received ideas, myths, and also books that deal with the entanglement of the past and the present, rather than the past as a cozy safe space that we can escape to.
In the introduction, you shared your reasons for crafting an untraceable life. I'd love you to read some passages from this introductory chapter.
Sure. How about this? I hope I'm not repeating myself here now. So, in contrast with the biographical optimism of much recent writing, the present book is about Leonardo's resistance to becoming a subject of biography, as well as the gaps in the historical record that have invited projection and fictionalization. We thereby gain an understanding of a Leonardo who is not like ourselves, who refuses our attempts to make him so, because the Leonardo who emerges here manifests a distinctively non-modern way of being a person, of having what we call a self, and the word self is in inverted commas. And in making Leonardo strange, we also gain an understanding of ourselves, or the historical contingency of our notions of personhood. We were not always as we are now, and there were always other possibilities. And we will also learn for our own desire for a fully realized Leonardo in the 21st century, as well as the various interests that are served, as well as ill-served by the ubiquity of this largely made-up character in our own time. I'll be returning to the documents to address what they actually warranted to say about the professional life and the personal life of Leonardo da Vinci. Despite an abundance of records by contemporaries about Leonardo, and despite thousands of pages of notes and longer drafts in Leonardo's own hand, there's remarkably little that can be said with confidence about his life, let alone about his character and personality, two words I also put in inverted commas. We know the circumstances of his illegitimate birth, we have very, very sketchy knowledge of his childhood and apprenticeship, and we know more or less about whom he worked for as an artist and engineer, and where. Florence, Milan, Florence again, Rome, France. For much of his surviving artistic production, however, dates and documents are a problem. About 1/3 of Leonardo's surviving paintings lack records confirming his authorship or indicating for whom the work was made. Accounts of Leonardo's works by contemporaries are often worryingly different from the surviving works that we connect them to. While a few contemporaries refer to Leonardo's charisma and sociable nature, there's almost nothing in Leonardo's own words about Leonardo himself. In stark contrast, we have abundant poetry and letters by his contemporary Michelangelo that dramatically, though no less fictively, stage the challenges and vexations of being an artist, his sense of betrayal and disappointment with patrons and family members, his professions of affection and of love, and his state of physical health.
That's fantastic. I really think it's powerful. So what's the significance of this introduction?
I think setting up I'm talking about the present. I'm starting in the present and, recent news stories about Leonardo, recent publications, the flurry of exhibitions and publications from 2019, which is the quincentennial year. So a lot happens. And then we go into the pandemic and there's various That also, affected the presentation of Leonardo in various ways. There's been a certain amount of media sleuthing around the Salvator Mundi and its sensational and scandalous sale price of 450 million. So at least 2 TV documentaries, all that morass of stuff I have to sort through. I talk about Da Vinci Worlds, which are basically media spectacles organized around this brand Da Vinci. But I'm also just there in the passage I read of setting up a kind of a useful contrast, or I think it's a very illuminating contrast between Leonardo and his younger contemporary, Michelangelo. And why is it that we get Michelangelo talking about himself all the time, usually in a very melancholic and vexed, melodramatic vein? Because Michelangelo lays claim to a poet's sense of self, or poetic fictions of the self that come from Dante, that come from Petrarch, the great Florentine poets. Michelangelo sees himself as an aristocrat and as a poet in that tradition. And Leonardo has no time for poetry. He likes Dante, but Dante for him is like an encyclopedia. It's a source of wisdom.
Please describe your research process, because it sounds like it was extremely deep and took a long time.
Well, the bibliography is a blessing and a curse, because you can never cover all the bibliography on Leonardo. There's just so much. But it's extremely rich, and it's not fully mined. I mean, there's like some earlier scholarship, which just goes under the radar, scholarship in the beginning of the 20th century, mid-20th century. It's increasingly the case that there's more documentary sources available online. Now, they can be a little bit hard to read because often there's no transcription. But, having the Vatican Library put the treatise on painting up online and you can scroll through the pages, it just has been very, very useful. So I never actually had to go to look at an actual document. I saw a large number in 2019 in the exhibition at the Louvre and a smaller exhibition of drawings at the Accademia in Venice. So that, but research process, it could be just daydreaming in a bus or a train after I've gone to see something. Writing in the middle before I've actually finished the research, and that was especially a kind of lockdown phenomenon. I just got to get some writing done today. So I think that's a key part of it.
Given the wealth of material available, how did you narrow the biographical scope to prevent writing a tome?
Well, my editor kept me in line.
Yes, editors are very good.
Yeah. And I had 2 very good outside readers. I don't know who they are, but they really helped me with cuts and summaries and this kind of thing. So I did have help with the editing. I really had useful feedback from my readers. And it's about really, I suppose, getting to the point and stripping away yet another example. So it means that when I quote Leonardo's notebooks, I had to be very, very selective. Just ruthless with myself, because there's so many like real gems in there that are just like not really discussed in the same way. And not much about the intimate life, but a lot about the dross and detritus of everyday life. A lot of lists, a lot of studio and household inventories, because poor Leonardo kept having to up and move all the time. And they're just like, we have a lot about like clothing, about strange objects. He refers to in lists like nutmeg, surgical equipment for crying out dissections, that kind of thing. So you can really lose yourself in this material. So I just kept having to pull back.
What new documents or evidence did you discover that previous biographers might have overlooked?
I think all the documents are discovered. I don't think there's anything new to be found. I'm sure I'll be proven wrong. But some of the material we know concerning Leonardo, it's been known about, but it's sort of not been studied. It's basically been overlooked. The image on the cover of the book, it's a profile of an old man with sort of like these Botticelli-like braids in his hair. And it looks like Leonardo doing a caricature of the only authentic portrait we have of Leonardo, which is a profile drawing by his pupil, Giovan Francesco Melzi. And it looks like he's having fun with that and drawing himself as this sort of freakish, eccentric figure, with these almost like transvestite kind of trappings. And I think this has got to do with his engagement with Botticelli, a sort of critical conversation between him and Botticelli, which, I think has queer resonances all the time. There's a text from mid-16th century Milan by an artist who went blind and became a writer called Giovan Paolo Lomazzo, a local Milanese, and he became sort of part of a literary academy. So he's an artist with literary aspirations. And a passage in one of his books, which is called The Dreams, is a series of imaginary dialogues with dead people, the same as dead people. It's quoted all the time. And it's about Leonardo's relationship with a 15-year-old apprentice in his own studio, who grows up to become one of his heirs. Giacomo Caprotti was known as Salai, which means like little devil, little Satan or something like that. And we know that Leonardo had a lot of problems with the child at the age of 10 years old. But this posthumous source says that they were lovers in very, very scurrilous ways, in very kind of vulgar ways. So that's always taken as a documentary fact, whereas I think it's actually meant to be mischievous. I don't rule out at all that Leonardo had those kind of relationships. I think that would just be Florentine, apart from anything else. But the people who cite that passage don't look at the rest of the text, where you've got all kinds of like outrageous allegations that nobody could have believed about Leonardo. That he was in love with a woman in Florence, and he was so heartbroken that he got on a boat and ended up in Illyria, where he ate fruit from a magic tree, and then he turned into a woman. And then he wondered if this woman he was in love with would love him in female form. So the implications of that are,
yeah.
I'd leave it to you, I mean,
Absolutely.
So what does that do to our understanding of something that we take as a historical source? Yeah, also just like moments where he talks about things that happened to him or things that he saw, I suggest that they should not be taken literally as recounting actual events.
That's so vital.
Just one more I could talk about, I think, that might be of interest. There's the so-called paragone, which is the 16th century. In the 16th century, there was this sort of compulsive habit to debate the relative superiority of one art form to another, that the word or literature is superior to painting, or that painting is superior to sculpture, and vice versa. And Leonardo, in his polemical introduction to his treatise on painting, says, I'm going to tell you why painting is just the greatest art in the world, and it's superior to music, to poetry, and to sculpture. And it's far-fetched. I don't think it's really a theory of art at all. But I think one thing I was really interested in tracking was Leonardo's professed hatred of literature. For somebody who has such a command of rhetorical, of poetical effects in his own writing, why he's always trying to keep a distance from the literary, insisting that he's writing with plain speech, and he doesn't have book learning, he doesn't have university learning, that he's just really speaking from experience, from his contact with the world as an observer or somebody who shapes matter with his hands.
So do you think he had a bit of a chip on his shoulder because he wasn't educated?
I don't think it's playing fast and loose with evidence to say he had some issues about not being educated. And he made very, I think, moving attempts to learn Latin. And in some of his notebooks, we have long lists of Latin vocabulary that he was trying to memorize. Finally, he does get this assistant called Giovan Francesco Melzi, who knows Latin and Greek. Essentially comes into Leonardo's studio as a teenager and serves as a secretary and translator.
Leonardo's notebooks are disjointed and fragmentary. How did you piece together a coherent narrative from such scattered and often cryptic notes?
That was challenging. I think I drove my copy editor mad because there are multiple editions of the notebooks of Leonardo, and they're all extracts, and they're all organized thematically. So if you wanted to see those extracts in their original context, that was often quite hard to organize. There are some codices, that's really like a complete notebook, for instance, which you can get in facsimile, like the Madrid codices. Others are just much, much harder. So I think that was a lot of like online, trying to make up my mind, trying to decipher what the papers were saying. I would say there was a serious amount of labor. Although there again, I'm certainly not the first who has done useful work. I think the scholar Claire Farrago has done terrific work on the writings that relate to painting, for instance, and she and a team of other scholars. The great Martin Kemp, emeritus at Oxford, a lot of work at Leonardo's science, and a lot of useful transcription of Leonardo's very difficult prose and decipherment of its very difficult handwriting.
You just touched on something that I was going to ask you. How did you reconcile challenges such as understanding sources in multiple languages and the technical content of Leonardo's writings, such as his notes on science and engineering? Did you collaborate with other specialists or use innovative research techniques to analyse these materials?
Yeah, sometimes I did ask colleagues at Hopkins, in engineering, so people in medical school know about physiology. And often I learned from my students, including some of my very young students, because many of them are studying to be engineers. They're studying to be doctors. And they took my course in Leonardo because they thought that would be relevant to their own professional goals. And they were often just very, very helpful in explaining how Leonardo is diagramming the play of reflections in a convex mirror, a concave mirror, I should say, which were supposed to generate heat, actually. They were supposed to concentrate the rays of light to power a furnace. And a student figured out, this just wouldn't work.
That's so affirming for you to ask your students for advice and help. I think that's really innovative.
Well, they chose the topics themselves, and I just learned from what they did with the topics.
In Chapter 2, titled Now Unmade by Time, Toward an Anti-Biography of Leonardo da Vinci, you explore many of the challenges of getting to the truth of your subject in the absence of corroborated facts. I'd love you to read a few passages from a section subtitled In His Own Words.
In his own words. Isn't it the case, you might say, that we know more about Leonardo than we do about any of his contemporaries? Yes, his written legacy vastly exceeds the output of any pre-modern artist, but assembling a life from these thousands of sheets poses a challenge. Leonardo's own charting of life events seems oddly sporadic and often pointless. It has been suggested that he'd acquired the habits of a notarial record-keeping from his father was a notary, but it's hard to see how his personal record-keeping squares with the notary's legalistic attention to dates, names, and places. He will write memos randomly on sheets of drawings without the meticulous accounting of commitments and obligations, typical of mercantile libri di ricordanze, essentially account books. November 1478, the date is partly cancelled, I began the 2 Virgin Marys. And on the same sheet, Fioravante di Domenico at Florence is my most beloved friend, as though he were my blank. Or, near the drawing of a castle, St. Mary's Day, the middle of August, at Cesena, 1502. Of the hundreds of such memos, remarkably few have to do with identifiable artistic commissions, or any of the normal business of artists or engineers. Notebook pages will on occasion be devoted to a haphazard keeping of accounts. The records of payments due and received become more systematic in the last 10 years of his life, when he's in the service of the French, of the Florentine state, and the Pope's brother, Giuliano de' Medici, handling larger sums of cash than he ever had before. There are multiple glimpses of craftsmen and people with useful expertise, or books that Leonardo plans to consult, lists of expenses related to boarders, toolmakers, and metalworkers. Though he possessed, one might say, nothing, Vasari says, in 1550, and though he worked little, he always kept servants and horses, in which latter he took much delight, and particularly in all other animals.
That's interesting that he didn't have much money, but he kept horses and servants. I'm intrigued by the structure of the book, which includes 5 chapters. Each chapter includes several subtitled sections. Subheadings are rarely employed in biographies. Why did you choose this structure and the subheadings?
I don't want to generalize about biographies, but I find that if you are organizing a book about a person in terms of a life story, then I suppose there might be a chronological mode of organization. And because I'm not doing that, I felt I had to put other tags in to tell the reader what the chapter was going to be about. And hopefully they work as pointers.
It's very effective.
But that's good. I'm glad you found that. I also just like reading spaces for the reader, because I think the last 2 chapters are really getting into close reading of the texts, and it can be very intense, I find. So I just wanted to just divide it up to make it a bit more easier to assimilate.
Yes, and it gives the reader breathing spaces, as you mentioned, to really process the information they've just read, because some of it is so detailed.
Yeah.
I'm also intrigued by your chapter and subheading titles such as Milan, The Last Supper and Its Leftovers, Now Unmade by Time, These Are Gods But Sick, and Leonardo's Absent Body. What's the significance of these titles?
Okay, Now Unmade by Time is one of his sort of rhetorical ramblings when he describes the remains of a whale or the fossil of a whale that he claims to have seen somewhere. And he goes into this rhapsody about a great fish and imagining it thrashing through the ocean and terrifying all the little fishes. And now it's been unmade by time and it's essentially buried underneath the mountain. So is this like a sort of poetic flight of fancy that's triggered by something he saw? Or is it triggered by something he read? I think it both are equally possible. These Are Gods But Sick, that is part of the 19th century reception of Leonardo as a kind of a decadent. There's sort of like a cult of Leonardo's modernity is a very, very sick kind of modernity because it's like us, us symbolists and aesthetes of the 19th century. Instead of being Renaissance heroic people, the Bacchus and the St. John and the Mona Lisa, they're weirdly monstrous or sort of very Baudelarian, this attraction to disease, being enervated or drug addicted or something, or having an erotic compulsion of some kind. So that's that. And Leonardo's Absent Body is probably the most complex because that really does address why Leonardo just does not talk about his own physical being, his own physical self. And none of these hundreds of memos ever record him being sick. People who wrote memos about whatever, even in their own account books, they will actually talk about the sickness of themselves or of a family member in the household, especially of a child. He records the death of his father, and that's as close as it gets, in very, very formal terms, as if he was writing in like a 19th century family Bible or something like that. So why is that? Why does he shy away from his body? I think it's because he wants to be taken seriously as a philosopher, and the muck and clamor of the workshop compromises that. That very, very physical, get your hands dirty kind of labor makes him need to distance himself to really becoming an eye that observes rather than a pair of hands that's mucking around in the viscera of animals that he's dissecting or preparing panels to paint on using urine and other nasty substances. And, there's just the general mess and the stink of the workshop.
I can't imagine the stink of it.
Yeah. Boiling fish glue, just think of what that might be like.
How do you balance engaging storytelling with rigorous historical scholarship, especially when dealing with periods of silence and patchy, contradictory historical records?
I think because I'm looking for glimpses rather than like a big tapestry. That's, again, explains the short chapters, because it really is a series of glimpses. You can't even call them snapshots. This paper record is already fragmented to begin with.
I like that concept of glimpses. I've never heard that before, and it really is consistent with your short chapters. So I think that's fairly innovative.
It's, think of Craig Brown, 100 glimpses of Princess Margaret, something like that. Although here he had much more material to work on with than I did. I guess he's got a new book on the Beatles now.
I think you've probably answered this, but there might be a little bit more you want to add. So which myths and misconceptions about Leonardo's life does an Untraceable Life attempt to dispel or reinterpret?
I suppose the time machine, that he's somehow like an astronaut from the future or something that drops onto the Earth in the 15th century and just knows all this stuff that nobody else around him had figured out. I mean, I'm not the first to challenge that. Stephen Jay Gould, this beautiful essay 30 years ago on Leonardo's fossil research, he challenged that as well. But it's remarkably persistent, this cliche that Leonardo is ahead of his time. How much of Leonardo's time do we actually understand? We haven't exactly got it all figured out. That's why it's an ongoing program of research. Why historians still have a job.
That's right.
Well, we're in the US, so for the moment they have a job.
Yes, take advantage of it while they can. Biographers sometimes feel tempted to fill in the blanks through speculation. How did you navigate the line between imaginative reconstruction and honouring evidence-based history when writing about the unknown aspects of Leonardo's life?
I think that imaginative reconstruction, or fabulation, as the scholar Saidia Hartman talks about it, there you acknowledge what you're doing. You're saying the archive is full of gaps. So why do we cede authority to an archive which is so partial to begin with? And it's so unreceptive of the particulars of certain lives. And she's talking about enslaved people in the Atlantic slave trade. And I like biographical fiction. And I cite at the end some examples of biographical fiction that I think work very well. Just to be absolutely clear, I'm not skeptical of biography as a practice, of storytelling. But if you're somebody like Andrea Wolf, you're working with the German Romantics, and it's almost like they're casting themselves as biographical subjects to begin with. They're imagining somebody writing their biography, and so their practice of writing letters, publishing outraged newspaper articles, book reviews of each other among the German Romantics. That's a very, very different kind of thing. And that's when the romantic biography has emerged as a form. And they're thinking about their own lives as biographies, but sometimes quite fast and loose with what they will do, with a historical life. But it's fiction, and it helps us to think about that past life.
There's a few Australian authors who left notes for their future biographers in the archives.
Really? Yeah.
So then, one of the dilemmas is, how does the biographer take control of the narrative? Because the subject wants to be portrayed in a certain way, and they want to control the narrative.
From beyond the grave. They're sort of,
they want to go.
Yeah.
To what extent did you avoid imposing modern values or assumptions on a 15th century figure?
Well, did I? I think we have to be careful, and I'm very upfront about this, not making Leonardo into some kind of version of ourselves, especially in academia. Often we are kind of liberal, progressive, whatever. So I suppose saying we can't project 21st century liberal subjectivity onto a person from the past. Or it's sort of the pop culture version of that is the attempt to conceive Leonardo as just like us, in that he's gay and he's vegetarian and he's an animal rights activist, an artist misfit, and probably a bit neurodivergent. So I have to take that forward and say, no, we don't need this. What's there is actually much more interesting than us. But, of course, I am stimulated by, a sense of openness to other conceptions of the self, rather than the boundary self. Like, say, I just referred to the romantic biography, the life as a whole, as a complete work of art, for instance. The kind of porousness of selfhood, how it's inflected by others, for instance, by connection with the lives of others, by empathy, by culture, whatever, by family, and so on. So that certainly enters into it. I hope I'm upfront about that anyway.
You concluded an Untraceable Life with a conclusion that explores the concept of anti-biography. I'd love you to read some passages from it.
To write an anti-biography means to disrupt the illusion of familiarity and organic coherence that conventional biographies present. It means writing against the grain of received ideas to which the life of an individual is endowed with meaning in advance, before the life is written, or written yet again. Anti-biography confronts the ways in which that life has been made to align with various grand narratives, the sense of history as in a unidirectional progress, with its renaissances, its breakthroughs into modernity, and its exclusionist notions of civilization. Anti-biography means demonstrating how the traces of life, its documents and material legacy, already disrupt the shape that's been forced upon. Instead of seeing artistic and literary remains as illustrations to a life mapped out in advance, the approach means letting them extend and complicate our idea of their maker in unforeseen and enlightening ways, especially in how this life unfolds the life of others. The problem, as I've said earlier, is not with the practice or feasibility of life writing. As a form of historical writing, biography has undergone intensive critique and self-scrutiny since the 1990s and even before, so that any number of biographers would see my characterization of anti-biography as fulfilled in their own rigorous and self-critical practice of life writing. Biography has been taken up as a medium of analysis in fields such as anthropology and political science, as well as history. What I've taken issue with this book is a particular biographical attitude especially manifest in writing of Leonardo. That is, the claim to know, a claim called into question by the silence of historical sources. one arising from an absolute and unwarranted confidence in Leonardo's place in the scheme of things, whether the course of history, the meaning of Europe, or something else.
That's excellent. Why did you end An Untraceable Life with this conclusion, and what's its significance?
I'm trying to sort of think outwards as to how we might explore Leonardo. What is the next stage? Is it more books? I lay out ideas for exhibitions. I talk about what I see as being very successful presentations or productions of Leonardo, like Mary Zimmerman's stage production, The Notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, which I think was first performed 20 years ago and was revived 2 years ago. So it's 8 actors on the stage, these very kinetic bodies on the stage, basically speaking extracts from Leonardo's notebooks, including some of the most technical. And that they're manifesting this kind of technical wisdom by Leonardo with their bodies through reconstructing, by acting out his principles of weight, of motion, that kind of thing. His writings on perspective, they run strings or tapes from their eyes, construct these cones of vision, or they will build bridges on the stage in a matter of seconds using a diagram by Leonardo. So that was fascinating. So it completely decenters Leonardo and it distributes it among a range of actors of different ethnicity and gender.
That's fascinating. I'd love to see it. What new insights about Leonardo da Vinci do you hope readers will take away from your book?
I hope they stay curious. I hope they see it as an ongoing open question, as something that's like ripe for discovery, even though so much of the media presentation might encourage them to think that Leonardo is like a face on a dollar bill, a solved crossword puzzle, etc. I hope they will go to see Leonardo as much as possible, even though that has its own complications. There are questions of access, to places like the Louvre and the Last Supper, which are not for the faint-hearted.
That's right. Yeah. So what do you believe is the role of a biographer?
What do I believe the role of a biographer? To keep past lives alive, not to be a tombstone, not to inter the biographical subject, the last word on so-and-so. It's an act of reanimation, a loving act of reanimation. I sometimes worry about biographers that kind of hate their subject or think they're smarter. I mean, I admire Anita Bruckner as a novelist and as an art historian, but her book on Jacques Louis David is like, oh my God, this is like such a kind of sense of bemusement or disdain. She presents him as a hysteric.
Yeah, it would be horrible living all those years with the subject in your head, because that's what happens when you're writing a biography. You live with that person and almost become them for that period of time. So how awful to have a figure like that you don't really like.
They just come to dislike if you like the art. So I've made my own foray recently, actually in the past couple of years, into trying to write biographical fiction and to see where I could take that with Leonardo, but not to write a fictive life of Leonardo, but to write about somebody who's observing Leonardo over years from the outside. And that would be the person that I've mentioned, I think 2 or 3 times in this broadcast, and that's Giovan Francesco Melzi, the young aristocrat who ends up in Leonardo's workshop. Now, why is he there? How does an aristocrat take up the profession of painting? And he does learn to paint. And he has this kind of secretarial role. And he also serves as something like a literary executor. He has all the manuscripts. He sits on them for 50 years. And he doesn't publish any of them. He might show them to people. He makes some transcriptions about the treatise on painting, which is now in the Vatican. But what happens to him in his life where he just doesn't take things any further? And then at his death, his heirs essentially sell off everything. That whole archive gets dispersed.
What a shame.
It might be a sad story. And I've actually pieced a lot of it together. We actually know quite a lot about this person. Raising 9 children and maintaining a certain demeanor of a person of status in Milan during the Counter-Reformation might have a lot to do with it. And maybe there was just too much suspicion around Leonardo. Maybe Leonardo was too high risk at a certain point, especially when Vasari publishes his quite judgmental, condescending life of Leonardo in 1550. And he says that Leonardo was a heretic. He came to a great heretical conception. That's a pretty aggressive thing to say about somebody like 1550. You get the Inquisition knocking on your door. So maybe there would be a risk that they would try to seize Leonardo's papers and scrutinize them for heresy. Or it certainly is not an incentive to put them out there in the world as publications.
I can't wait to read your novel.
I hope it gets, if somebody wants to publish it. We'll see.
I'm sure they will. So thank you so much, Stephen Campbell, for chatting with us about Leonardo da Vinci, An Untraceable Life. Instead of trying to present Leonardo as a neatly packaged Renaissance genius, you address the gaps, contradictions and uncertainties that make him such an elusive figure. By exploring what we don't know as much as what we do know, you paint a rich, complex portrait, one that feels more human, mysterious, and in many ways more fascinating. In closing, what stands out from our conversation is the idea that biography isn't about filling in the blanks with certainty, but sometimes about acknowledging the unknowns. Leonardo left behind thousands of pages of notes, yet vast portions of his life remain obscure. Rather than smoothing over these silences, Stephen Campbell leans into them, showing us that history is not just a record of facts, but also a puzzle of missing pieces. This approach makes An Untraceable Life compelling to read and challenges us to rethink how we approach biography as a genre. An Untraceable Life reminds us that history is not a fixed story to be told, but a dynamic conversation between past and present, shaped by the questions we continue to ask. As long as Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, paintings and ideas captivate our imagination, his life will remain, in many ways, untraceable, but endlessly worth exploring. So, Stephen, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on, Gabriella.
Thank you for listening to Biographers in Conversation. Special thanks to my producer, Andy Marr, web manager, Dylan Hamilton Foster, and Sunny Lauderdale for the music. We'd love you to take a moment to rate the show on the website, across social media, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your family and friends and on social media. To discover more about my guests and their biographies, head over to their show pages on biographersinconversation.com. There you'll find all our episodes and ways of getting in touch with us. I'm looking forward to our next conversation about the choices every biographer faces. I hope you are too.